Well, thank you very much for this warm welcome. Honored to be able to speak to you at the high seminar of the Slavonic Studies at Stockholm University. And specifically because you've invited me to talk about a very interesting Polish monk soldier and a philosopher and a theologian, Józef Maria Bocheński, in whose name the year 2020 has been established in Poland, among other figures like actually Karol Wojtyła and Roman Ingarden. But today I would like to speak to you about Józef Maria Bocheński, and the title of my lecture is Philosophy as an Investigation of the Roots of Things, Józef Maria Bocheński's Thought and Philosophical Heritage, or Legacy, one could also say. Because I'm going to focus on Bocheński's understanding of philosophy. But before I do that, I would like to start with a brief timeline and biography, mostly because I believe that in most cases philosophy translates from the theoretical endeavor into the life of a person. And I believe Józef Maria Bocheński is a good example of studying this, how philosophy always permeates into the life of a person and how the life of a person is itself influenced by the theoretical endeavor. So let me start. Józef Maria Bocheński, as you might know, was born in 1902 and he died in 1995. So his life really stretches right through the 20th century. And indeed, his life was not free from very important events, historical events occurring in the 20th century. But let's start at the beginning. He was born as Józef Maria Bocheński in Czuszów, which is 40 kilometers briefly northwest of Cracow. And he was a son of Adolf Bocheński, the senior, but also a brother to Adolf Bocheński, the junior. So you should not mix up the two. And so a son of Adolf Bocheński and of Małgorzata Dunin-Borkowska. His brother Adolf Bocheński was a later Polish political thinker and a soldier, and he died during the Second World War. He also had a second brother, Alexander, who was a writer and translator and an essayist, so it was quite a literary family. But most importantly, perhaps, is that he was also a brother to his sister, Antonina Bocheńska, later Zawadzka, who was a teacher of catechism throughout the post-war Poland. But she is important insofar as she has received the order just among the nations of the world, the order that is given by the Institute of National Remembrance in Israel, Yad Vashem. And Bocheński was very proud of his sister's involvement into saving Jews during the Second World War. The order, as I'm sure you all know, is given to those who were involved in saving the Jews during the Holocaust. And Antonina Zawadzka, because she's known under this name after being married, Antonina Zawadzka helped to save 3 Jews, risking her own life, and that's why she was praised for it. Now, Bocheński, already as an 80-year-old boy, having graduated from high school, he enrolled in army during the Polish-Soviet War between 1990 and 1920. So he joined after graduation, so in 1920, and he partook in this Polish-Soviet War, specifically in the series of battle all known as the Battle of Warsaw of 1920, or the miracle on the Vistula River, where the Red Army has suffered an enormous defeat and has been stopped from invading the Western Europe and joining the revolution in Germany. This military service, as you will see later, has translated into theoretical work of Bocheński, and I will speak to you about it a little later on. In 1920, Bocheński started to study law at the University of Lviv, and until 1922, which is a year in which he moved to Poznan in order to study there for the following 4 years, and the subject was mainly political economy. In 1926, he joined the Catholic Seminar as a 24-year-old man, and a year later he also joined the Dominican order, taking on a name Innocent Mary, which Innocent Maria, which is why some of his publications might appear under this name, Innocent Maria, rather than Józef Maria, which is his name given on his birth and baptism. In 1920, but perhaps I should here add, he joined the Dominican order, and the specific charisma of this order, apart from other things, is scientific involvement, which manifests itself perhaps most fully in the examples of Albert the Great of Thomas Aquinas. And so young Bochenski was sent off to study further. In between 1928 and 1931, he studied philosophy in Freiburg in Germany, where he excelled in philosophy, in particular in logic. And I must add here that Freiburg was really the top center for philosophy during interbellum in Europe. So Bochenski really received a very thorough and good education in this discipline. But in 1931, he defended a doctorate in philosophy. And in between 1931 and 34, he was sent off to study theology further at Angelicum. Angelicum is a university that has been created from a Studium Generale, a 13th century Studio Generale, in which Thomas Aquinas taught himself. And it is one of the top Catholic universities in the world, so this also shows the capacity that young Bochenski had. In 1938, he swore eventually solemn vows as a priest and a monk. The following year, he defended his second doctorate, this time in theology, and between 1934 and 1940, he was a professor of logic at Angelicum. So he taught logic at Angelicum. And in 1938, so 2 years earlier, he also came back to Cracow to the Jagiellonian University, where he defended his habilitation in logic, and the habilitation was based on the exploration of the history of model logics, as Historii Logiki Zdań is the very title. In 1939, he was sent to serve in World War II as a military chaplain in Poland, Italy, France, England, and Scotland. 1939 is also the year in which Bochenski left Poland not to have returned to it for until 1987. After the war, mostly due to Bochenski's Sovietology, his Sovietic studies, Sovietica, he wasn't allowed to enter the communist Poland, and the first time he could visit his homeland again was only in 1987. But let's go back to the Second World War and Bochenski's participation in this war. Perhaps the most important involvement of Bochenski is that of the year 1944, when he fought. Well, he was a chaplain, but he also fought during the famous Battle of Monte Cassino. As you probably know, Monte Cassino was a series of attacks on a historic hilltop abbey, a Benedictine abbey established in 529 by Benedict of Narsau. It was also a monastery, the first Benedictine monastery in Europe. And Benedictines are the oldest monastery in Europe as such. And Thomas Aquinas studied there as a young boy. And this very abbey has been situated in the middle of the Italian peninsula on the way from Naples to Rome, and it has been controlled by the by the Axis. And thus, Axis have prevented the Allies' forces entering into the north of Italian peninsula. Thus, the Axis has prevented the Allies from reaching Rome. And the battle for the strategic hilltop is hence also called the Battle for Rome. And it very much depended on the result of this battle, whether the World War II would still go on or would eventually end. And after a series of unsuccessful attacks, American, British, and so on, eventually also the Polish Second Corps, also French forces and British forces were sent in order to fight there. Before that happened, the Allies have been considering and analyzing whether they can eventually start bombing the location. As I said, it's a historic location, and the order was the monks were still present in the very monastery, so they had to be evacuated. And when the monks have been evacuated, eventually the Allies first bombed the hilltop and then sent off Polish Second Corpus in order to fight there. And eventually, during the final days, due to some substantial losses in the among the Polish soldiers, Bochenski himself also fired the artillery. And eventually, on May 18th, the Polish flag, followed soon after by the British Union Jack, was raised over the ruins of the 6th century Benedictine Abbey. And as I said, Bochenski's involvement in this battle, and also in the Battle of Warsaw, or the Battle of the Vistula River, have translated into him philosophizing about the military service. And he has wrote down what is called a military ethics. I will talk about it in a moment. But it's important that you remember that he has been an active soldier. And to the point of firing artillery and fighting as a regular soldier in the 1920. Before I go into the topic of his military ethics, let me talk a little bit about his involvement into the organization of the Polish soldiers' cemetery at Monte Cassino mountain. Perhaps a few know that it was really him who was sent away to help with the organization of the cemetery. And if you have ever visited Monte Cassino, you will know that the Polish cemetery is celebrated on the monument with a paraphrase of the epigram from Thermopylae, where in 480 BC a great battle between the Greeks, led by Leonidas, against the Persians took place. And in Thermopylae, as you might remember, this little epigram, typically attributed to Simonides, goes as follows. O stranger, go tell the Lacedaemonians that we lie here obedient to their words. And the monument that has been raised in Monte Cassino is a paraphrase of this little epigram. It goes as follows. O stranger, go tell Poland that we lie here faithful to her service. And it has been put there because General of the Polish forces, Władysław Anders, proposed this as a commemoration of the Polish sacrifice. Bochenski opposed this idea. He believed that the monument should really quote a Polish poet, and he suggested a three verses from Wierzyński, from his poem Modlitwa za zmarłych w Warszawie, a prayer for those who died in Warsaw, which roughly translated would go as something like, because from their blood and their suffering over the debris, our fate has risen, and in the storm it stands before us, magnificent. So this was Bochenski's proposition, but as I say, it was the General Anders's proposition that has been chosen. So if you ever visit Monte Cassino, please do remember that Bochenski has been involved into the organization of the memento. Anyway, it's also worthwhile to mention that the description of his participation in the Battle of Monte Cassino and also in the war is all put and described in his memories, in his memoirs, Wspomnienia. And if you're interested in this first-hand account of the battle and the war, please do check it out in his autobiography. As I already said, Bochenski's involvement in both Polish-Soviet War as a regular soldier and in the World War II as a chaplain to fighting Polish troops has been a reason why it has translated into his theoretical endeavor of writing down and conceptualizing a military ethics. And I believe it's a rather original achievement in Polish in general in 20th century a philosophy to construe a particular military ethics. As I said, it's or I haven't actually yet, but the title of this particular ethics of the soldier is De Virtute Militari, on the virtue of the soldier, a draft of military ethics. It has been published only in 1993. As you will observe, most of the books of Bochenski that were printed in Poland were only able to be published in a regular circuit after communism fell, so basically in the 90s. He, of course, wrote down this ethics way earlier, and he has dedicated it to the Polish soldiers of the Third Polish Republic. So, what is this military ethics? Actually, Bochenski starts with the explanation that ethics is universal in the sense that there are certain general values and general virtues which apply to all people. However, specific activities involve the person more with one particular set of values or virtues more than the other, some other possible virtues or values. So a specific profession might activate the response to a certain set of values more than a different profession. And because of that, each discipline first faces respective duties and respective difficulties, by which I mean that such a profession engages a person more with some particular set of values and demands. So, for example, a nurse will need to be merciful and kind much more often than she will need to be courageous in her profession. This is simply due to the nature of her profession of taking care of the sick and wounded. However, a soldier will have much less opportunity to respond to values such as mercy or kindness, and on the contrary, he will need to be courageous much more often than a nurse. And this is precisely why we need specific applied ethics of particular disciplines or professions. Therefore, soldiers also need their own respective specific ethics, and this is exactly what Bochenski proposes in his De Virtute Militari, on the virtue of the soldier. So, what are the rules of this ethics? Actually, Bochenski starts with a way more basic problem, the problem of whether it is at all morally right to partake into a war as soldiers do. This moral question takes us back to the very beginnings of Polish philosophy at the Jagiellonian University, basically to the question posed by one of the first rectors of the Jagiellonian University and a lawyer, canon law lawyer, Paweł Wojtkowicz, who is a 14th, 15th century Polish thinker, who was sent and argued at the Council of Constance that there is a distinction between a just and an unjust war. Paweł Wojtkowicz is mostly known for being a promoter of religious tolerance, but he also has made a significant contribution to the distinction between the just and an unjust war. Back in those centuries, Poland was involved into the war with the Teutonic Order, who argued convincingly that since Poland is in alliance with some pagans, the Teutonic Order has the right to attack our lands and fight with us. Wojtkowicz argued that there are certain conditions of when the war is just, and he named the subject of the war. That it has to be a proper subject of the war, so a certain party that leads the war has to be a ruler of the land. Secondly, that the object of the war is also just. The cause is important as well. There has to be a necessity and no other way to fight. Finally, a spirit, so the intention with which you fight, and also the legitimacy of your actions due to certain laws. So the agreement of the ruler and of the head of the church. Now, Bochenski has his own ideas which relate to Wojtkowicz in a large part. By the way, whatever I have said about Wojtowicz has been stated during the Council of Constance in 1415. This is where he made his big case against the Teutonic Order. Going back to Bochenski, he also questioned whether it is just, morally desirable to lead a war. And he will say yes, if firstly, the object of the war is just. So it is the defense of the rights of your nation, for example, the freedom of your nation to speak in your native tongue, the freedom of religion, the freedom to rule oneself, and so on. But secondly, it also has to be, such a war has to be exhibited by the legitimate power, not some revolutionary leader or a small group that represents itself as the right party. It has to be the legitimately elected power that pursues such a war under the conditions of defending an important value, such as the value of being independent when attacked. And finally, the last condition is that such a war has to be led in the light of the legal international laws that govern the rules of wars. So his answer is yes, it is possibly morally desirable to lead a war, and therefore it is also possibly morally acceptable to be a soldier. And if you already are a soldier involved into a war, you will need to develop what Bochenski calls the specifically military virtues. And among these specifically military virtues, he lists the following. Now, first of all, decisiveness. A very contemplative soldier who ponders existence will possibly not do his job very well, because if you hear an order, you need to go and act it out right away. So decisiveness, which is connected very much with the virtue of obedience, is one of the prime virtues of a soldier. Obedience is important insofar as armies are a hierarchical structure, and the pursuit of the final goal largely depends on the obedience of the soldiers to act out the orders that come from the top. It's the top-down kind of a hierarchical structure. And this brings me to a second virtue of a soldier, a very interesting virtue called bravery, as opposed to courage. Now, courage has been, and this takes us back to classical philosophy of, say, Thomas Aquinas, where courage is typically defined as readiness to achieve a certain goal despite dangers lying ahead. And such behavior we can also find among animals, because if a Bernardine dog sets out to rescue a child from an avalanche, it definitely pursues a certain goal despite dangers lying ahead. However, in this case, there is no moral context to this action, because a dog is simply trained to act out what he does, and the dog does not understand the moral obligation that falls upon it in order to do what it does. Moreover, we can also talk about courage in the example of the robber who breaks into a bank. We probably all would say that in a certain way he is courageous insofar as he insofar as he pursues a certain goal despite the danger lying ahead. However, we cannot say that this is bravery, simply because the moral context of the whole situation is unacceptable, is ethically unacceptable. And Bochenski will only speak about bravery when there is an element of courage, so there is the readiness to pursue a certain aim despite dangers lying ahead, but it is within a certain morally acceptable context, and it is also pursued due to a free will choosing to partake in such a context. So really it has to be an ethically acceptable, or actually morally preferable, situation in which one acts out the courage, and one acts it out freely. Finally, Bocheński will also add that we can only speak about bravery when the danger is really substantial, when there is high risk involved in the situation. So we can talk about courage in all small situations when there is a small danger lying ahead, but bravery is really reserved for those conditions and situations when a risk and a danger is grave. Civilians typically need to be courageous in everyday life because they might have to pursue truth despite certain danger of being, let's say, opposed by someone, but this is not yet bravery. Bravery is when there is a high risk at stake. And this, of course, happens during wars. And this is also why Bocheński will say that an experienced soldier who already has been in the battle and has been wounded in the battle and knows what's at stake, such a soldier has a far graver or exhibits far graver bravery when he goes once again into the battlefield than a regular new soldier who has never been in the battle and doesn't yet know from his personal first-person experience how high is the price that one might have to pay, possibly this being your life.
Finally, camaraderie is a virtue of a soldier because soldiers work in teams. So companionship and being on good terms and ready to sacrifice for your comrades is a important virtue of a soldier. Later, perseverance, and it connects with the farther virtue of patience. Wars, argues Bocheński, are usually long, and therefore a soldier will always need to be able to wait out a certain difficult situation and not lose spirit. In particular, not lose hope. And this brings me to the last point, perhaps I will first discuss the last point, the developed positive fighting emotions. So there are emotions, of course, which are at stake when you fight. And those emotions might be those of fear, or courage, or hope, or weakness. And a good soldier will be the one who, on the whole, has more of those positive fighting emotions, such as anger. It's good to be angry when you're a soldier. Courage, this readiness to pursue a goal despite dangers. And hope, when you're hopeful, when you believe in the fact that the war or the high aim that you're aiming at can be achieved. Now I'd like to go back to the virtue of generosity, which is a point in which Bocheński goes back to Aristotle megalopsychia, being of the great soul. Now, a soldier necessarily needs to be a person who pays a lot of attention and is motivated by a high goal, such as the defense of your country, of your nation, of your language, of your freedom, and is ready to pursue such a very high goal at a great cost. For example, he has this large soul in the sense that he is ready to make great sacrifices. Now, a soldier should not pay too much attention to very small goals and affairs, like where do I sleep, what do I wear? A soldier really needs to be someone who has those high goals and is ready to pursue them with great sacrifices. That's why this megalopsychia, from Greek, large soul, this generosity. You have to be able to be ready to give a lot, and you have to be able to be motivated by high goals. Now, in contrast, let's say a virtue of a monk who works every day in scriptorium, let's say copying some manuscripts, would require a different set of motivation. You would have to be motivated by a different set of values than the ones who appear in the soldier ethics. And as I said, Bocheński published it after the war and dedicated it to the soldiers of the Second Polish Republic. Now, if we may go back, still before the break, to Bocheński's biography and summarize it. After the war, he was appointed a professor at Freiburg University in Switzerland, where he soon became a dean of the philosophy faculty and continued for many years to work in logic. even though he was invited as a visiting professor all over the world to speak mostly about two subjects, logic and Sovietology. Now in 1959, Bochenski, who considered himself obliged as a philosopher to seek truth and also unveil mistakes when they occur, Bochenski established an Institute of East European Studies at the Freiburg University, where he was a dean, which was the first institution in the world dedicated purely to the study of Marxism, Leninism, or communism, you could say in slightly broader terms. And Bochenski dedicated almost 15 years of his life to the study of Sovietica, so really an in-depth study of the Russian written works in Marxism and in Leninism. And he did that, of course, abroad, because in Poland he would not be able to in the communist Poland, he would not be able to pursue such a goal. And later in 1961, he was also invited by the German government to start a similar institution in Cologne. It's Ostkolleg that he established. He was a founder and a director of this Ostkolleg. And perhaps here I will shortly summarize what are his biggest achievements on this field. So apart from the Institute of East European Studies at Freiburg and the Ostkolleg in Cologne, he also edited numerous monographic volumes dedicated to the study of Marxism-Leninism. The series that he started at the Institute of East European Studies was called Sovietica, and altogether throughout his life it published 53 monographic volumes. Additionally, he also published series of studies in Soviet thought, and there has been 35 editions of this journal. It was a scientific journal. And the brief summary of what is his thought on the Sovietology is contained in this first volume you can see here, Lewica, Religia, Sovietologia, The Left, Religion and Sovietology, once again published in Poland in the 90s. And it is perhaps worth mentioning here that those two institutes which he started have trained almost a half of all Sovietologists in the world that existed after the Second World War in Europe and in America. So those two institutes, they pioneered really the scientific study of what communism, the doctrine of communism is, of what is Marxism and Leninism. And he also trained most specialists in this field. So that's quite a big involvement of his life. And to go back to his biography, he in the 60s and in the 70s, Bochenski, due to his very hard work in logic and in Sovietology, he was awarded a couple of honoris causa doctorates at the University of Notre Dame, at the University of Buenos Aires, also in Milano, and from the Jagiellonian University. In 1988, after changes occurred in Poland, the Jagiellonian University also awarded him with the honoris causa doctorate, and also Warsaw, an Academy of Catholic Theology in Warsaw awarded him one as well. As I already said, in 1990, his sister received the Yad Vashem medal from the Israeli Institute. He died in 1995 in Freiburg after having visited Poland in 1987 for the first time. And today, 2020, as I also remarked, is due to the 25th anniversary of his death, it is a year established in his name. And among the interesting points of his life, perhaps I could mention that being almost 70, he received a license of a pilot and served as a pilot for the 20 years before he stopped due to his age. All right. Now, having spoken a little bit about Bocheński's involvement with Sovietology, I would like to pay a little bit more attention to the conceptual content of this criticism. So Bocheński made a sharp distinction between an ideology, religion, and science. And he would always identify Marxism, Leninism as an ideology, and would make a sharp distinction between this form of thinking and all forms of religious thinking that are to be found in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and so on. He would say that both ideology and religion are worldviews. This is not what science is busy with. According to Bocheński, why I will speak about it in the second part, science is analytical in the sense that it focuses on small pieces of facts and analyzes them. When it comes to formulating the explanations of the totality of human experience, this is not what science does. It's far too broad to be scientific, really, in this matter. What is the way we call a thought process that explains the totality of human experience, this is what occurs in a worldview, when we construe a worldview, Weltanschauung. And there are two types of worldviews. Religion is one, and ideology is a second one. But as I said, there is a fundamental difference between the two of them, because religion, all religions in the world, they pertain to two topics, sacrum and transcendence. Sacrum, which is the sacred, is a natural object of all religions. Religions assume that there is such a thing as something which is sacred, and they identify it differently, but they all talk about the sacred. The second thing that is very typical for religion is to believe that there is such a thing as transcendence, which is to say that certain facts, certain pieces of knowledge, certain truth are beyond a human grasp, and there is this boundary of what we can reach, and behind which there is a certain mystery to be revealed. And basically it is to say that our knowledge or our pursuit of science cannot ever explain everything that there is in the world. There's always something that eludes our grasp, and that's the transcendent. And many religions will say that God is transcendent in the sense that it escapes our grasp. We can never fully, with our finite mind, grasp what God is. Now, ideology is very different, because ideology claims to be able to explain everything about the world, and in mostly it is very visible in Marxism, Leninism, and how they approach the history of the world. Marxism, Leninism, and all kinds of ideology, they always propose a complete explanation of the world's past history and also of what is coming to happen, of the future. You can call it historiography, and you will find it in Hegelism, you will find it in Marxism, Leninism, and in all kinds of ideologies. They will always tell you what happened. They know exactly what happened. There is no gaps in our knowledge of history. We all know that this is how, let's say, the proletariat fought the upper classes. And the science of history is very different from this ideological form of historiography. The science of history would claim that there is the transcendent in history, insofar as there are gaps in our knowledge when it comes to antiquity and so on. Ideology will always claim to know the whole story. Second typical characteristic of ideology is that it has a recipe for saving the world. Now, of course, certain religions propose some form of moral claims of what is good to do, but religion, let's say Christianity, it does not say or doesn't have a recipe of what we should do here and now in the world to make it all good, to eradicate our suffering, to eradicate all pain, and so on. Now, ideologies propose such a solution. They claim to have such a solution of, if we do this, let's say we emancipate the proletariat, we will have a completely happy societies without any wars and without any pain in the world. So this is why he would vigorously oppose ideology as going really beyond what human reason can achieve. And before we go on a break, I would like to pay a little attention to what Bochenski did in the discipline of theology. He was mainly a logician, so a philosopher, but he also contributed greatly to theology precisely because he implemented logic into the very theological claims. Here you have the list of his involvements, let's say institutional involvements in theology. He is the one to have started the Polish Thomistic Review, Polski Przegląd Tomistyczny, which exists until today. It is a prominent journal in one tradition of theology, that's Thomism. Thomism is a tradition that stems from Thomas Aquinas. It is a tradition which builds upon the premise that Aquinas put forward in the 13th century. There are basically two main cognitive attitudes. There is faith, which is based on certain claims that are given to human beings from God, and those claims are to be deducted from Holy Scriptures, for example. So that's one attitude, faith, fides, but there's also reason, ratio, and those two, which is basically a very argumentative, logical form of thinking and pursuing certain ideas through a process of reasoning. And the idea that you can work with both those two in theology, on one hand, rest on the premises from faith, and on the other, use the argumentative lines in order to elucidate these. This is what is typical of Thomism. And he belonged to this school, but he and others, already before the war, they did something very original. They proposed that logic could be implemented into theological claims. And of course, this has been done to some extent before, but Bochenski is one of those thinkers who would say that you really can formalize, so put in logical formulas, certain dogmatic or theological claims, and you can pursue further developments in theology by this very logical attempt on working on formulas. And logic of religion is the example of such developments in theology. On a more broad scale, you could say that it's a defense of the rationality of faith, because it shows that logic can be implemented into theology. And Bochenski, this journal that I mentioned, Polish Thomistic Review, which has been developed in Cracow. Cracow is a home of the Dominicans order school, in which I actually also teach, but that's beside the point. But he has established there this Thomistic Review, and the school that has developed there is called Cracow's analytical School of Thomism, or Cracow Circle Thomism, and it's precisely this attitude of implementing logic to theology. Now, to finalize before the break, let us concentrate or somehow systematize what Bochenski's achievements and work was all about. So in the early 30s, until the end of the war, you could say that he was a neo-Thomist thinker, insofar as most of his work was dedicated to the study of logic and implementing logic into this particular branch of theology, which is Thomism. Now, after the war, for about 10 years, you could say that it's a historical logical period. It is the time that he really was a professor of logic, at first in Angelicum, then in Freiburg. And during this time, he published really a world-renowned history of logic, Formale Logik. which is really the first contemporary book-length investigation of the history of logic. And it's probably good, in order to understand how difficult an achievement that is, to just imagine that there are formalized systems of thought, because logic is formalized. It proposes certain formulas and it operates on symbols, who stem from Stoicism, who stem from various medieval schools. And really not many of them have been studied properly, because you do not deal, as a logician, you do not deal with a text that is written as words. You really deal with formalized symbols. And in order to be able to write a history of logic, you need to sit down upon those medieval manuscripts, decipher the formulas, and really come up with the idea of what logic stood behind that. And this is what Bochenski did, and this is why he has been so broadly recognized all over the world as a logician, because he actually wrote it is the most in-depth study of the history of logic, right from the antiquity until the very modern times. It's an incredible effort to write down such a history. It's part of his habilitation was dedicated to this, and Formale Logik is really this greatest book that he dedicated to the subject. And as I said, 1955 and the next 15 years is the period which he dedicated to criticism of Marxism, Leninism, and also an in-depth study of what it really is. So that's a period dedicated to Sovietica. And 1970 to 1990 is a period of, let's say, systematic logical period, where he still developed new ideas in logic, not really history of logic, but construing new formal logics. And that's the period in which he also implemented his approach to particular topics, such as what is authority, what is religion. And perhaps it's a good time to have a break. After the break, I would like to talk a little bit about what was really his method in philosophy. What does it mean to implement logic into particular disciplines? So if you also have some questions, perhaps you can also think already what you would like to ask. After the break, as I said, we will start with the question, what is philosophy according to Bochenski? So thank you so far.
Okay, then let's go back to the problem or the question, what is philosophy according to Bochenski? I have sent you one of his most popular books that has been published in very many editions, in very many languages actually. I mean his Introduction to Philosophy, and I have invited you to focus a little bit on chapter 2, which is dedicated to Bochenski's introduction into philosophy. And I here have put forward for you a couple of quotations. Let us just focus on them, read them out loud, and I'll give a comment about what they mean. So the first one goes as follows. Philosophy is merely a name for certain attempts to clarify or explain various as yet immature problems. And so this shows basically that Bochenski understands philosophy as having explanatory function, explanatory role towards certain problems. Okay, that's not much yet, so let's go farther. A second quotation. In a certain sense, it is a universal science. Its field is not restricted to something limited or particular like those of the other disciplines. So there is an element of universality to philosophy in the sense that it can be applied to all kinds of problems. Those problems which he called immature, they can be of any type. Philosophy needs to explain, has this explanatory role, and it is also universal, that it can, insofar as it can be applied to all kinds of disciplines and intellectual endeavors. So let's say we would be defining philosophy in Aristotelian terms. We have genus proximum, insofar as it is an attempt to clarify things and an attempt that can be applied to any problem. But what is differentia specifica of philosophy? Let's listen to the longest quotation I've put forward for you. Philosophy distinguishes itself from the other sciences by its point of view. For when it takes an object into consideration, it seizes exclusively from the standpoint, so to speak, of the borderline, of the fundamental aspects. In this sense, philosophy is the science of foundations. At the point where other sciences come to stand still, where they assume conditions without further investigation, that is where the philosopher first begins to question. The sciences know, he asks what knowledge is. The other establish law, and she asks what a law is. The average man and the politician speak about meaning and purpose, but the philosopher asks what actually should be understood by meaning and purpose. Thus, philosophy is a radical science in the sense that it gets closer to the roots of the matter than the other sciences, and that it wants to question and investigate farther at that point where the others are satisfied.
So, starting from the first quotation, philosophy is, of course, an attempt to clarify and explain certain problems, but it is mostly interested in the very foundations of our thinking. So, all other sciences just choose an object and analyze it, like geography analyzes the material extension of the world. Physics analyzes certain a priori laws that rule and govern the physical reality. Geometry is focused on certain abstract relations between spatially extended objects. Now, philosophy is the one that goes really very much to the beginnings, to the assumptions of human thinking, and it really starts to question there. It does not try to undermine those foundations. It merely tries to understand them. Really goes to go down to the very roots of things, to the very beginnings of our thinking. And logic, therefore, has been a natural object of interest to logicians, because logic proposes very basic laws of thought, such as, let's say, the law of non-contradiction, which basically states that nothing can be, no claim and a very reverse of this claim can be true both at the same time. So P and not P cannot both be true. And this is precisely what is those kind of laws and recognitions is what is born from reaching out to the very roots of things. Here, I am putting forward to you the classification of various philosophical methods of thinking put together by Bochenski in 1954. So that's really the attempt at writing meta-philosophy. So the philosophy of philosophy. What are the various methods in philosophical thinking? And Bochenski starts off with analyzing phenomenology. That's a prominent German school of thinking in Poland, represented by Roman Ingarden. The word stems from Greek phenomenon, meaning the phenomenon. And this form of analyzing really pays attention to objects in the world. So phenomenologists would focus on a certain, let's say, social phenomena like family, or they would focus on a certain object like literature and analyze this very object. So they start with phenomena. Now, this is not the tradition Bochenski belonged to. Bochenski belonged to the tradition of analytical philosophy, which really focuses on the language. Phenomena are too complex or difficult to grasp as a beginning of the philosophical endeavor. Language, however, is something we can concentrate on and really go deep into its semiotic and syntactic structure. And this philosophy of language, so really analyzing syntax and semiotics of language, is what analytical philosophers did. It's this move away from the things themselves, as phenomenologists would say, back to language and really analyzing the language. And the three methods in this analytical philosophy that you could implement and or distinguish would be the semiotic method that focuses on the relations of symbols, then axiomatic method when you start off with the analysis of those most fundamental axioms of our thinking. Here you see the formalized version of the principle of non-contradiction. It cannot be that P and non-P. So it's not true that P and not P are valid at the same time. And finally, there's also the reductive method in analytical philosophy, which goes basically from the antecedent to the that basically deduces from the antecedent the consequent. So it uses the implications, so reasonings if then, and it goes from one to another. To perhaps, this is a bit specific what I've been saying, but to summarize, analytic philosophy is the analysis of the very fundamental issues that other sciences assume, but it focuses on language, differentiating different meanings of the words, the use, their application, the semantics and the syntax of particular sentences. This is what Bochenski would do. This is how he would approach all subjects he would talk about. He would not talk about phenomena at hand, about states of affairs. He would rather focus on how we use language to describe those things, and he would go deep into the analysis of the language. And he would also say that this is a very simple and sober consideration about what particular words mean and what is the meaning of the compound utterances. So that's the tradition of analytic philosophy. And I would like to implement this approach to a couple of examples. And this perhaps will reveal to you like what do analytic philosophers do when they analyze things. So let's say we ask, what is truth? And you see that Bochenski starts with a sentence like this: it is easy to see what we mean. And here he writes, of course, about the word truth. It is easy to see what we mean. We mean that something is true when it obtains. Thus, we say that John is a true friend when he is in accord with our ideal of a true friend, if it is true of him. And this is where Bochenski really looks down at the sentence and singles out the elements that can be extracted from it. It seems like it's a simple question, simple sentence, but actually, looking upon this sentence, you can distinguish two different understandings of truth. We mean that something is true when it obtains. Thus, we say that John is a true friend, and this is when we predicate truth upon John. So we can distinguish firstly the ontological truth, that which is, in this case, John. John is truth in the sense that he is a true friend. This is how we speak about the world, and therefore there is such a thing as ontological truth. Things that are, and they have certain properties, and we can name them. But we also say that the utterances, sentences, are true when they really relate to the reality adequately. So we can say that the sentence, John is a true friend, is also true. And this is when we will talk about the logical truth, which is different from the first meaning we just distinguished. And therefore, truth can also be called an adequacy of the proposition with the state of affairs it describes. This is a classical definition of truth that can be that was anticipated in Aristotle, then really developed by Thomas Aquinas, and Bochenski commits to it as well. As you see, he really comes to those insights from the analysis of language. And he will also ask this truth that we just described, truth as the adequacy between the proposition and the state of affairs. Is it always absolutely true? So if we say John is a true friend, is it absolutely true? He's always a true friend, or is he only a true friend to someone? If we accept the standpoint that truths are relative, we will understand, we will take on the side of relativism, which says that truths are relative to a point of view. We can also say that things are only true, like we say that a sentence, John is a true friend, only is true because it properly describes reality to us. It is useful to speak in such a way because this is how we easily deal with the world. This would be the standpoint of pragmatism. Finally, we could also say that some things are only true to us because this is actually how we see the world. So John is true because this is how we look at the world, and this is what we put in it. It's not that John is really a true friend. It's really how we construe in our mind him to be. That would be idealism. However, Bochenski would discard relativism, pragmatism, and idealism, and he would commit himself to ontological realism, which basically assumes that the reality is in a certain way, and it is for us to be discovered. Realism is ultimately a standpoint in which you assume that things are in a certain way, and when our thinking is in the process of discovering them adequately, this is when we think truthfully. And here is the extended quotation from Bochenski, who describes that years ago, after much struggle, I myself decided for realism. And the more I think about it, the more I am convinced that this conception of the truth is the right one. I know that not everyone will do the same, for the question is difficult. But regardless of what others will accept as solutions, I want to warn you of one misunderstanding. In this question, one's decision must be uncompromising. All of human knowledge must be understood either as comprehending or as creating of the object. So we really have to, it's an either or question. We either understand the reality as something which is in a certain way and we discover it, or we stand on the side of idealists who say that our minds create the reality. It's not that we discover it, we really create it. And every compromise here is false, as among others, the popular one according to which we would have forms and light waves in the outer world, but no colors. One must maintain either that there is no external world at all, or that our minds create everything, or, on the contrary, that it creates nothing behind the combination of contents, and that everything which we know must be present in some way outside the mind. All right, so this was his philosophical standpoint in regards to truth, very significant topic. As for the human being, I will just very briefly summarize to you that Bochenski understood a human being to be distinct from all other animals, despite the fact that a human being is, of course, an animal too, but it is the animal that is capable of creating tradition and a language which is not to be found in other higher species of animals. Now, of course, right now we know, and so did Bochenski, who died in 95, that certain linguistic structures can be found in, let's say, dolphin communication or in higher apes, but human language, which Bochenski dedicated his whole life to investigate, human language is capable of formulating symbols which are trespassed intergenerationally. Let's say when in the 1800s, the Europeans discovered the stone of Rosetta, which was written in ancient Egyptian and a little bit in Greek, we could decipher it and we could unravel the meaning that stood behind those abstract symbols. Now, this really went through very, very many generations. The language that is found in higher species of animals does not formulate such symbols which would make it possible for the knowledge to be transmitted throughout the generations. This is only found in a human being, who thus creates traditions. So let's say when we have a principle of non-contradiction, first discovered by Aristotle, we can learn about it even if many generations forgot this principle. We can go back to it when it is put down on paper in an abstract symbolic form, and we can learn from it. This is what we do not observe in animals. And this form of reason and reflection is typically human, as is freedom. So the will, the capacity of acting freely out of one's own will. Animals, on the whole, Bocheński would say, are conditioned by their instincts and their biology. Humans are capable of stepping over their own biology and deciding to do something else than what the biology, like feeling of fear, for example, what the biology dictates. Finally, a human being is the only one in the world that is conscious of one's own finitude. Animals are not capable of understanding or sensing, according to Bocheński, that they are finite, that there is the end to them, the end that we inevitably all must face. And the last thing, which would be an application of Bocheński's method to a particular subject, would be what I have proposed here. The question which Bocheński asked in the 70s, he wrote, Was ist Autorität? Einführung in die Logik der Autorität. It's one of his well-known books, which is an in-depth analysis of the logic of authority. He asks what is authority, and then analyzing particular utterances concerning to what authority is, he puts forward a philosophy of the authority. It is interesting that a philosopher does that because argumentum ab auctoritate is often treated in philosophy as a mistake, to argue out of authority instead of to argue ad rem, so about the subject matter, could be considered a flaw of reason, because instead of putting forward a certain argument, you just rely upon somebody else's authority. But there are conditions in which it is correct to rely on an authority, simply because it is not, the structure of science could be such that it is built up by certain steps and accumulated knowledge, and in a brief lifetime, one cannot achieve all this knowledge step by step, which is why we must all rely on certain authority. However, a lot of mistakes could occur when we think about authority. That's the mistake typically known as the misplaced authority. So in order to reveal this, let us focus a little bit on Bocheński's analysis. He starts with such, you could say, trivial observations, but this really is the philosophy of language. So he starts with, distinguishes two different meanings of word authority. First of all, authority can mean a person. When we say Adam is an authority, we say that this person is an authority. But we can also say that authority is just a feature of a person, their characteristics. We can also say Adam has an authority. That's a different use of this word. So what really is this authority that can mean both a person and a feature? Well, it's simply a relational concept insofar as it means the status that one has in relation to others, and which is basically to say that authority only appears when there is a context of at least two people. There has to be two. One plays the role of an authority when it possesses the feature of authority, and the other one is the one to whom the first one is the authority. And this is always an asymmetrical relationship, because even if both people are authoritarian to each other in some aspects, when it comes to the particular field we're concentrated on, only one is an authority and the other one is the receiver of this authority. And therefore, authority would assume three elements: a conscious subject, a conscious object, which is to say that there is no authority among, let's say, the world of things or animals, or among plants, so to speak. Authority is possible to occur only in the realm of conscious subjects and objects. And then there has to be a particular discipline in which one is authoritative, which is to say that when one is an authority, he reaches a certain defined level of knowledge in a particular field, and the other one does not have the same access to this knowledge. And if that is so, no one can be an authority in all disciplines because there are such pieces of knowledge which are restricted only to one subject. Bochenski gives an example of pain. There are situations in which we treat children as authorities. For example, when a doctor is examining a child about their pain in the stomach, the kid really is the authority when it comes to what kind of pain it feels. Nobody else in the world has the knowledge of this kid's pain. Only the child has this particular experience, and therefore it is the authority on the particular subject matter, being the stomach, the pain in the stomach. So authority really would be something that can apply to everyone, and no one can be authority in all disciplines of knowledge because there are pieces of knowledge of human experience that are restricted to particular subjects. We may go back to it if you're more interested in this particular analysis of authority. I just wanted to put it forward to you to really show you how this language analysis is done. We start with utterances and we break it down in pieces. We sometimes come up with trivial theses, trivial observations, but they're always true insofar as this is how the language works. So to summarize, we would of course have to ask what philosophical tradition did Bochenski belong to, and of course declaratively he was an analytical philosopher. But as I said, since he implemented logic to theology, he also belongs to the Cracow circle Thomism, which was a school developed before the Second World War in Cracow. And since, as you saw, his language analysis also led to a particular distinction between what is a human being and what are animals, we could call him perhaps a personalist in the sense that he distinguishes, or he would draw a distinctive sharp line between the world of conscious subject persons, such as humans, and the world of non-humans, such as animals. And I would here like to also ask whether we could ascribe Bochenski to this broad tradition of philosophia perennis, eternal philosophy, whether he would be the one to say that there are such truths which are eternal and which philosophy can discover. Now, on one hand, yes, he would say that there are such truths, and when we know something, we can know it absolutely, not just relatively, as I tried to show you in his analysis of truth. But on the other hand, we have to say that Bochenski never built any system, because as an analytical philosopher who was very dedicated to a scientific approach to language, he would always only analyze particular bits of human language or human experience, and he would not construe a large system outside of it, because this he would basically say that we don't have any right to do so. We really focus on particular subject matters, and from this we can only conclude the particular analysis, not a very broad philosophical system. So he would oppose any systematic philosophy that, having analyzed only parts of human experience, would then construe large, all-encompassing theory. To overview the disciplines in which he worked, we would have to list, of course, logic, epistemology, history of philosophy. As I said, he mostly contributed to history of logic, then Sovietology, and he really pioneered such form of scientific research in this discipline. Theology, as I said, in particular Thomism, also political theory, of which I have spoken perhaps a little less, but maybe from his military ethics you can deduce a little bit of it. And then Bochenski is also known for his popularizing of philosophy, which is done in his autobiographical and personal writings. Here is the, oh, why did it close? Sorry, this suddenly closed. I'll open it up again for you in a moment. But here I put forward to you the most well-known attempts of Bochenski at popularizing philosophy. So some of Bochenski's works have been published in over 1 million copies, which is possibly due to his very clear and understandable, comprehensible language. He really would explain everything with examples and with particular sentences, which are very clear and easy to grasp. This is perhaps why his books were so popular, and among the most popular ones, which really help to popularize the discipline of philosophy, is 100 Superstitions, which is a little book he wrote about philosophical superstitions and mistakes of thought. It was published in Poland in 1987, and you can see here on the right a big book as it was published. And earlier in the communist Poland, the book could not have been published. It only appeared in the Second Circuit, so to speak. And on the left, you can see this tiny book is Bocheński's 100 Superstitions in this Second Circuit edition. Then the Book of the Wisdoms of the World is very popular still, a tiny book of little pieces of wisdom one can rely on, as you would say. Philosophy and Introduction is the volume I've proposed to you to look at. It also has been sold in very many volumes, and it's written in a very achievable style. Also, What is Authority? Was ist Autorität is one of his attempts at popularizing philosophy, where he specifically did not use any formal logic formulas, but only wrote in normal sentences. And I have one example of those superstitions I spoke to you about, but well, let's see if you have other questions first. And this is all from me so far. I hope you enjoyed this little history of the life of a monk soldier and a logician, Józef Maria Bocheński. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the debate. Nice questions. And then let me, if I may, put forward to you one example of Bocheński's famous 100 Superstitions from 1987. As a matter of fact, as Professor Zdenska has pointed out, 100 Superstitions is the Polish zabobon, is a word that is very strong, a bit stronger than in English zabobon. It's prejudices, but in a understood in a magical form. A superstition would be the most direct translation I would go to, but I just want you to know that he named it with a very strong word, and it is the word that actually has permeated into Polish philosophical language, and many refer to it as a certain specific kind of mistake. So what he did in 100 Superstition is put forward various concepts and developed a certain definition of each concept or a short description of it, plus certain superstitions that arose around a particular topic. And I propose to concentrate on the topic of patriotism because Bocheński was a patriot. And he would define patriotism as love towards one's own homeland, towards one's own, both country and a nation, homeland, its specific culture, and so on. Love towards one's own homeland, and there is nothing wrong with it. It's not a superstition, it's merely a certain attitude. However, some superstitions could arise around patriotism, and one would be nationalism. Nationalism would be such love of one's own homeland that goes together with the hatred towards other nations or states. Bocheński would argue that one has a right to care more for one's own homeland than for other lands and countries and their respective cultures and nations, inasmuch as everybody has a right to dedicate their service to someone, for example, to the members of their own family. Inasmuch as they have this right, they also have the right to dedicate their services, their life's effort, to a particular home and a country they were born to, they live in. And this is absolutely all right and then morally acceptable to dedicate the service, your own service, to your own efforts to the service of your own home. However, if this would go together with the hatred towards other lands of other people, other nations, other countries, this is where nationalism is born, when you not only cherish and work for your own nation or country, but you also start to hate other nations and other countries. You see them as competition, as a danger, as a threat to your own culture and homeland. This is where nationalism could start. But to mistake patriotism for nationalism, to think that every form of patriotism leads to nationalism, would be just as wrong as saying that every love for your own spouse would translate into hating all other women. No, it doesn't. One can choose the object of their love, whether it is on an individual level of particular people or the social level of a particular country or a nation. And this is merely called patriotism. If it would go together with a certain aggressive tendency towards other nations, this is where nationalism would start, and it is indeed a problem, but one should never mix up the two. Patriotism in itself is a good thing. And the second misunderstanding that arose around patriotism, according to Bochenski, is what I translate as egalitarianism in respect to the love of one's own nation or country. It is related to what I have already said, and it is the belief that it is unjust to love one's own home or nation more than others. So if somebody thinks that you don't have the right to care more for one nation, or you don't have the right to dedicate your life's efforts to one nation, but you have to be equal in respect to all of them. You cannot ever have any bias in who you love more. This is when the standpoint is expressed, the standpoint of egalitarianism in respect to love of one's own nation. And Bochenski would say it's a mistake. One doesn't have any obligation of of loving all countries or all nations equally when one is born to one country, or when one has served and lived in one country or one nation. They have the right to love it and serve it more than they do with the nations that they have never met or even researched properly. And therefore, to propose such a moral rule of egalitarianism with respect to the love of nations would be a mistake. And if somebody is prejudiced towards patriotism because he thinks patriotism is stepping away from this rule of egalitarianism, this is where such a misunderstanding, such a superstition would occur. All right, so this is this little addition about 100 superstitions, and that's all from me. Once again, thank you very much for your attention and for all the questions. It was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you all very much.